Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. My name is Jean Boone, and on behalf of DIA, I'd like to welcome you to today's Solution Provider webinar, Partnering with Patients to Streamline Trial Operations, Protocol to Regulatory Submission in 60 Days. This event is brought to you by DIA in cooperation with Alira Health. And before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes for everyone to keep in mind. That the views and opinions expressed in these slides are those of our presenters and should not be attributed to DIA or any of its affiliates, volunteers, employees, chapters, councils, communities, officers, or any organization with which the presenters are employed or affiliated. And as a reminder, these are the intellectual property of our presenters and are protected under copyright laws of the US. The DIA and DIA logo are also registered trademarks or trademarks of Drug Information Association. All other trademarks are the property of their respective owners. So now that the not so fun stuff is out of the way, today is meant to be very informative, and we would hope that you will participate with Q&A as part of the panel discussion at the end of our presentation. We do encourage you to drop any questions in the Q&A found at the bottom ribbon of your screen, and we will address those at the end of the presentation with all of our wonderful presenters, which brings me to who we have today. With us today is Renee Wilmon, Senior Director of Evidence and Outcomes with Alira Health. We also have with her Jennifer Landon, the Director of Patient Advocacy and Partnerships, also with Alira Health. And joining them on the panel at the end of today's first part of the presentation is Christy Greeley, Executive Director and Vice President of Research with the Cystinosis Research Network, and Eileen Wall, Senior Manager of Medical Affairs with Leadiant Biosciences. At this time, I'm going to hand it over to Renee for your presentation.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jean. And thanks for everyone for making time to join us today as we approach the holidays. I'm going to go through a very short presentation to cover a couple of concepts and tell you about our approach to partnering with patients and patient advocacy groups at Alira Health. And then it will be my pleasure to introduce the rest of our panel to you so that we can talk about a specific case study that we all had the opportunity to collaborate on earlier this year. So to get started, I'll tell you a little bit about Alira Health. Our organization's mission is really to humanize healthcare, and one of our primary goals in all of our interactions with clients and partners is to work with patients and have a direct patient impact. So we have a variety of service offerings that are enabled by our digital health solutions that can span the entire product development lifecycle, from product development, regulatory consultation, to patient engagement, market access, as well as clinical trial operations. We do operate globally. However, the case study that we're going to discuss today was focused in the US. So in terms of partnering with patients throughout the product development lifecycle, we really have tried to take an integrated and longitudinal approach. Our digital platform, Health Storylines, which is central to the work that we do, and the case study that we'll discuss today, allows the patient to be a core contributor to their healthcare journey through both active and passive data collection. And we've really tried to create a tool that allows patients to use this tool in their day-to-day self-management so that it's adding value to each individual, while collecting data for real-world data generation, clinical trial operations, or patient support programs. So as you can see, this tool can be applied really across the entire product development pathway and a patient's journey to be a companion and a source of interaction for them with the rest of their care team and healthcare ecosystem. In terms of what it means to partner with patients, obviously, the terminology around patient centricity has been very important in our industry for quite some time, but I felt it was important to really distinguish between patient partners and stakeholder partners. In this instance, the elephant in this visualization is often the patient, and the different stakeholders, the various scientists who are touching part of the elephant, but don't always understand the full lived experience or relevant dimensions of the patient experience. So it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about patient partners, we're really trying to access patients and those with lived experience of the condition. That can include their family members, caregivers, and organizations such as patient advocacy groups that are representative of the population of interest. And this can also involve the members of the research team. We want to involve those patients and their family and organizations as direct members of the research team, involving them in planning, conduct, and dissemination of the research, and moving away from viewing them simply as subjects or involved simply in the data collection phase of research. And this is distinct from stakeholder partners, where we may, over time build a lot of expertise and knowledge of the patient experience based on interactions with them. But these members of constituencies based on professional experience will always be different and have a slightly different perspective on interacting with patients relative to the patients themselves. And why patient centricity and really accessing this direct patient involvement is so important in clinical trials is that studies in the UK and the US have found that really only a third of trial sites meet their accrual targets, and around half are forced to extend their enrollment periods. So when we don't work with patients from the outset in trial design, in recruitment strategies, in setting it up so that trials are truly patient-centric, we fail to meet our goals, and it's really difficult to connect with patients and to help them understand the value of their participation. The most common pitfalls of clinical trials are often based around that patient experience and difficulties in connecting with patients, failure to recruit based on overly restrictive inclusion and exclusion criteria, having a heavy burden on patients where they may not be able to sustain their involvement in a trial, or a focus on outcomes that are not relevant to patients, so that the effort involved in visiting a site and providing their data doesn't necessarily align to the kinds of differences that they want to see in the treatment landscape and in the ability for industry to meet needs that they have. This has numerous impacts on product development, from inefficiencies. This extends timelines, it expands costs. It can really expand the number of individuals and organizations that need to be involved in a trial that don't always result in improvement in these outcomes. And this can have a negative effect on the ability to bring treatments to market. And over time, this will impact the trust that patients have with industry, and ultimately that trust that patients would have to participate with the healthcare ecosystem, to participate in clinical research, and to view themselves as important stakeholders is something that we want to change and really help them feel as if they are the most important stakeholder in these endeavors, because ultimately the healthcare ecosystem exists to serve their needs. So when we think about what this patient-centricity can mean in clinical trials, there are a couple of ways that we can address this. Patient-centric trials are specifically designed around patient needs, everything from the easiest way for them to contribute their data, the most relevant location for them to be when they're sharing that perspective, whether they need to visit a site or whether we can make it more accessible to them in their homes. We want to design them to be inclusive of a wide range of patient characteristics, and potentially even considering things like other comorbidities and social determinants of health in that inclusion. So going beyond the kind of first rung that we often think about in terms of gender, sex, or race. And we also want to be including patient-reported outcomes measures, so that we're not only looking at the clinical characteristics and what from the physician's perspective is making a difference in outcomes. And we can achieve this by co-designing with patients so that their preferences, their needs, and their interests are taken into account in trial design. So overall, these are going to be designed to improve the quality of research, because we know that if patients have been engaged in the research design process, if they understand the voice that they have to contribute and the relevance that this will have on their individual journey, this will help support engagement in the trial and sustaining patients' involvement throughout what can potentially be a very long and onerous period of data collection. And then at the conclusion of studies, it's important to share these results with patients so that we can continue to foster that trust, to share with them the value of their participation, and continue to educate the patient population on their role in contributing to research so that it can continue to become more and more collaborative. So we do have some patient-centric legislative and regulatory frameworks that are now in play that are supportive to this effort. Of course, the 21st Century Cures Act is continuing to have implications and the ongoing access that patients will have to their own personal medical record will continue to drive changes in this area. But the FDA's patient-focused drug development set of guidances has also been really critical in supporting industry and knowing the different ways and the best practices to engage with patients, to collect patient input, to how to go about identifying what is important to patients, and how we can continue to develop fit-for-purpose outcome assessments that will gather that patient input in a systematic way that can be replicated across studies. So within Alira Health, we've taken this kind of collection of inputs and tried to create a system that is technology enabled that allows us to interact with the broadest number of patients and their caregivers as possible. So these are the three pillars that underlie our digital health practice. High touch being that we really want to make sure that we're continuing to foster that trust through interactions with individual patients, as well as through partnership with patient communities. So this is where we have a number of partnerships with patient advocacy groups to address a variety of therapeutic areas and patients who may have a variety of conditions. We also want to make sure that through the patient's use of this tool, it's enabling them to have a better connection with their care team and with those who need to support them, and empowers those patients on their healthcare journey so that as they provide data, they gain deeper insight into their own health condition and have access to educational content and tools that may be co-created or generated by the patient advocacy partners. This is then delivered through a technology implementation. And so the app allows for that self-care management as well as patient monitoring, the ongoing generation of real-world evidence, so we can run either registries or clinical studies using this tool, and allowing that research continuum to flow from the clinic to the home so that we can adopt a decentralized or hybrid approach to allow patients to offer their input from wherever they are. And we can continue to use this data in novel ways, connecting it to things like medical record data, to claims data, to patient input, and the view from the care providers as well. So connecting this app with nurses, with a variety of therapists to support patients with specific needs, and continuing to share insights that we've gained from that interaction in terms of the KPIs or metrics around study delivery, but also what tools such as passive data collection, wearables, remote monitoring, how these other features that are enabled by the digital approach can continue to improve our ability to conduct research with patients. So some of the differentiating features of the Health Storylines platform as we've developed it, and which is allowing us to partner with patients in the design and execution of research, is really this approach to community building. So we want to create patient communities with whom we can build long-term, deep relationships across therapeutic areas so that we get a good sense from their day-to-day interaction with the tool, what their unmet needs are, where are they experiencing the highest symptom burden, what are real-world patterns of care and medication use, so that we can inform the development of clinical trials and select endpoints based on patient insights. And by continuing to engage with patients and feed back to them the results of research and best practices, we're allowing them to better manage their condition, but we're also seeing how they adopt that information and kind of continuing that feedback loop based on the adaptive platform. We can build new tools to gather data that it becomes clear is important, and add tools to make it useful for the patient. So it really is about that symbiotic relationship where we're supporting patients and helping them understand how they're supporting industry by engaging with this tool and offering their data. So this approach has been applied really across the entire life cycle, and we can do this in collaboration with advocacy groups to the greatest effect. Whether that's from the perspective of designing a study or a protocol with a panel of patients, or having materials reviewed by patients, as well as identifying insights from patients in our platform to help select endpoints or what pieces of information would be relevant to that condition. The specific identification and recruitment of patients is facilitated by this long-term relationship. And then patients can be enrolled in the platform efficiently based on our existing connection with them, some of the digital tools that are already there in terms of e-consent or telehealth modules to help onboard a patient or explain the study to them, gathering the data throughout the course of a study remotely or in combination and collaboration with a site, and then monitoring those patients to capture data throughout a study, and capturing patient feedback throughout a trial and afterwards to ensure that the patient's experience of contributing to that study is as streamlined as possible. And if there are kind of changes in health status or other logistical issues that emerge over the course of a study, they can be addressed in real time. So this helps reduce loss to follow-up while improving the data quality. And so this is going to kind of tee us up to talk about a specific example where we were able to employ this platform and to benefit from the relationships with patient advocacy groups and sponsors who understood the value of long-term relationships with patients. And some of the benefits, both for patients and for sponsors, that we want to highlight are that, for the patients, this ability to reach out to them digitally and to really thoughtfully consider their experience in the trial streamlined the study experience for them. And it created an opportunity to maximize familiarity, where we could use a tool that they were familiar with. We didn't necessarily have to take them to a new location. We could have some of this data collected in the home and provide an immersive experience. As a result, this can facilitate long-term relationships with those patients by introducing them to the tool that they can use to manage their condition. And this also provides opportunities to participate in future research, because once they're in that ecosystem and able to continue to interact either with other patients or with sponsor organizations with materials created by the patient advocacy group, it's easy to engage them in future opportunities to contribute either their opinion in something like reviewing a protocol if they've participated in research in the past, or to participate in future clinical trials. And from the sponsor's view, this can streamline collaboration within and across organizations. When you have existing relationships in place, it becomes possible to kick things off very quickly, which we'll be able to describe for you in the case study shortly. For some of the reasons that I've discussed already, we have seen an increase in data quality because you have patients who are engaged, you're collecting data and endpoints that are relevant to that patient population, and that the way you're collecting it is comfortable and easier to navigate on behalf of the patients. And the digital nature of the data collection creates an audit trail so that you can easily monitor and retrospectively look at where there may have been gaps and improve the next time. And tools like automation or alerts that can bring certain patient behavior to the attention of the site or clinical research associates can facilitate that patient engagement, reducing burden on the sites or the research personnel, while also facilitating reporting of the results, because the data collection has already been streamlined to connect all of the elements from e-consent to the data collection from the patient and to the results. So these benefits will be more clear to you around the specific case study that you can see some imagery that's related. And if you do have specific questions about the study that we discussed, or more broadly around the use of digital to facilitate these relationships and making trials more accessible to more patients, please feel free to include those in the chat, in the Q&A box. But next, it's my pleasure to now bring our other panelists onto the call and introduce themselves. So I will, I guess I probably should have introduced myself before starting, and I realized I didn't do that. So I apologize for that. I'm the Senior Director of Evidence and Outcomes at Alira Health. So my role is really with the real world evidence team, connecting our digital platforms to our variety of partners to ensure that that data that we're collecting is not only patient friendly, but connected to the evidence goals of the industry. And next, I'd love to introduce my colleague, Jennifer Lannon.
Hey everyone, I am Director of Patient Advocacy and Partnerships at Alira Health, and had the privilege of being the kind of main point of contact between CRN and Alira Health and Mediant in this study that we're about to talk about.
Thanks, Jenny. And next, I'd like to introduce Christy Greeley from the Cystinosis Research Network.
Hi, I'm Christy Greeley. I'm Executive Director and Vice President of Research for Cystinosis Research Network, also an employee of Novartis, and just need to point out my disclaimer that my views and opinions are my own and don't necessarily reflect those of my employer.
Thanks, Christy. And last but not least, Eileen Wall from Leadiant Biosciences.
Hi, everybody. My name is Eileen Wall. I am a Senior Manager of Medical Affairs at Leadiant Biosciences. For those of you that don't know about Leadiant, we are a U.S. research-based pharmaceutical company, and we dedicate considerable resources to the research, development, and distribution of novel and effective therapies for patients affected with rare diseases, and cystinosis being one of those rare diseases, thus our great partnership with Christy's group. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I am just going to want to kind of get started by clarifying for the audience that, cystinosis is a very rare disease. And so to set the stage on how this would complicate the ability to quickly execute a trial for us, Christy, could you perhaps kick us off and tell us a little bit more about the disease and the patient community that were involved?
Sure. So cystinosis is a rare genetic metabolic lysosomal storage disease. It causes an abnormal accumulation of the amino acid cysteine in various organs and tissues of the body. That accumulation causes a wide array of complications, including kidney failure, photophobia, blindness, diabetes, hypothyroidism, swallowing difficulties, really the whole spectrum. Cystinosis affects about 2,000 people worldwide, with approximately 600 of those diagnosed living in the US. And so I, as we mentioned, lead the Cystinosis Research Network. I've done so for over 20 years because my son Jack was diagnosed about 22 years ago. And so we function as an all-volunteer nonprofit dedicated to supporting and advocating research, family support, and then education of the public and medical communities on cystinosis. And we work together with cystinosis organizations around the world, including Cystinosis Network Europe and the Associated Cystinosis Advisory Board. And so we're a small but mighty community, we like to think.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Christy. So I'm sure, those listening can already get a sense just from the reach and the activities that you've described on how partnering with an organization such as yours would, bring a lot of insight into that patient experience and what may not be as readily apparent to those who are not as close to someone who may have experienced this disease firsthand. But Eileen, from Leadiant's perspective, could you tell us more about kind of how the need for this study came about and what the reaction was on Leadiant's side, how you were feeling about your ability to pull off this study kind of on a short timeline?
Sure, absolutely. So, we recognize that patients with cystinosis have disabilities, as Christy pointed out, including dexterity issues and such. And our product, Cysteran, is a drop actually that is administered into the eye to dissolve corneal crystals, which is one of the complications of this terrible disease. And so we make this product, and we wanted to make have a newer, more patient-friendly bottle that was easy, convenient to use, where the patient could administer this, or their caregiver could administer it. And so, we wanted to accomplish this, and the question became, how can we enroll in this trial with a rare disease, small patient population, as Christy's pointed out, in a short timeline during an ongoing pandemic? So we had to do this virtual because, we couldn't pull the patient into an office to have them administer the drop in front of somebody in person. And so we needed to turn to our advocacy partner, Christy's group here, it being the case. Because of our long-term relationship with her, we had the trust in their group. We knew that they could identify these patients quickly, speedily, help us navigate through the patient enrollment and recruitment part of the trial, which we were able to pull this off really successfully in a short timeline in this virtual pandemic environment. So it was pretty impressive, actually. So.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Eileen. I think there definitely was a kitchen sink of kind of logistical hurdles to overcome with this study. And I think even in the absence of the pandemic, we found that with such a rare population, when they're geographically distributed, when you are leveraging a site-based approach to try and identify where those sites should be and kind of coordinate all of that, it can add significant time. So Jenny, maybe that's something you can speak to as part of the team who received that study concept when we first engaged with Leadiant. And just to give a sense of the timeline, we're actually coming up to the 1-year mark since the introduction was first made. So kind of the timeline that we were able to meet with Leadiant and Cystinosis Research Network, execute the study. What, when you first heard about it, solutions came to mind as being essential to execute what was required?
Yeah, thanks, Renee. As Eileen mentioned, I think the lack of geographical barriers, and Renee, you mentioned as well, this being a fully decentralized study by design, I don't know that we would have been able to pull this off in the timeline required had we not been able to enroll any patient across the US. So I think that was one of the biggest factors, was our ability to write this protocol to include patients and adults and pediatrics, and also caregiver mediated or independently administered, use of the bottle. So I think that was important. I think also, we've heard from Christy that there have been others in the space where they were poorly designed eyedropper bottles or other instruments, and doing something that's a meaningful endpoint and a meaningful study to patients, I think, is also valuable and helpful. And so, my sense is that it was kind of like a welcome opportunity from the patient community to make sure that it was a product coming to market that they were actually going to be able to use and use well. We, also knew that a strong advocacy partner was, kind of, again, we wouldn't have been able to do this in the timeline that we needed to if we didn't have a strong advocacy partner. So the fact that Leadiant had this long-term relationship with CRN already was just huge. On our side at Alira Health, it was really important for us to very much prioritize that relationship and getting them all of the information that they needed as fast as possible, and answering any of their questions or issues in a super rapid timeline. So I kind of like dropped everything. And in this few weeks was like, okay, first priority of the day is to get CRN an update on where we are with recruitment. Make sure that any questions that they have, I'm pulling the right people in internally to get them the answers that they need. And so, I think that having the strong advocacy partner to be able to invest the time was such a privilege, and we needed to recognize that privilege that we had and be super grateful and thankful and as responsive as we could be for the time that they were putting in. As Christy mentioned, they're an all-volunteer organization, which, especially in a rare disease, many of the advocacy groups are. And so, being flexible with your timeline, when you can meet with them throughout the day, how quickly you can provide updates, and just being very grateful for the value that they're bringing to the study is super crucial.
Amazing. Thank you, Jenny. And Christy, we know that, sponsors and service providers are becoming more and more aware of the importance of partnering with patients and with organizations like CRN to successfully deliver studies and to advance product development. Can you speak to some of the best practices and kind of lessons learned that you've seen as a patient advocacy group that you wish sponsors were more aware of when they approach groups like yours?
So like I mentioned, we're kind of mighty patient community. And also, I often talk about the embarrassment of riches. We have 4 approved treatments, for a disease that affects about 600 people in the U.S. So that's great. So we've had a lot of experience with a lot of sponsors, either for marketed products or things, that are in development. For example, a gene therapy treatment. And what I found in my 20 or so years in this community and in the rare disease community is this sort of early, consistent, collaborative relationship with patient advocacy groups is really the key to being able to, accomplish what we did with this study. So you can't just swoop in, when you need something. You can't just swoop in when you're ready to market a drug. You can't, just think about it in terms of sponsorships, giving money, supporting grants, that sort of thing. It's really sort of that team mentality of having a patient advocacy group and its leaders and its community really along for the ride during the development of any kind of a product. And, that's everything from, the thinking about what the protocol looks like and how patient-centric that is, and, what makes sense in terms of, the burden on a patient, to things like what we're talking about today, right? The design of packaging. Are people going to be able to use it, in this case, an eyedropper bottle in a population, with muscle wasting as, a defined, part of the disease. And I think the other piece of this is, when we have this kind of long-term relationship in place, we as advocacy leaders can work to act as sort of the gatekeeper and help a sponsor understand, what our community looks like. We can, help with issue management. We can help with special projects like this. We feel that we've been part of the ride, part of the development process, then we feel much more willing, to jump in. And when it's, a situation like, this particular one was, where, there was a big call from the community to, have Sisteran come back on the market. We're happy to help in any way we could, which included our influence, and be able to locate patients who would be proper subjects for the study, who might be interested, and connect them, to your organization, to complete it.
Great. No, thank you so much, Christy. And certainly, I think the nature of this study being the usability study and considering the packaging and that day-to-day experience of the patients of having to self-administer that medication, I think, we often in industry think very much about, the mechanisms of action and how a treatment might be impacting symptoms or the patient experience, but how that patient is going to interact on a day-to-day basis with the delivery of that treatment is not always something that's given as much careful thought. So that's a really great point about this example. And Eileen, Leadiant has obviously, been a very patient-centric sponsor for a long time, and the trust that Christy had with your organization to be able to support this speaks to that. And this is obviously especially important in rare disease. Can you speak to what some of the benefits of working with CRN that you think other sponsors perhaps would not have anticipated might be?
Wow. Yeah, sure. I mean, as Christy said, we've had a long-standing relationship with the CRN, and boy, I mean, it's been fantastic because we mutually reap so many benefits for this, and the patients ultimately are the winners out of this. So, because this was 100% virtually conducted, we could go to Christy's group and help identify where are these sites. What about the inclusion exclusion criteria? Are there some patients that right off the top, we may not be able to consider because of whatever reason? So helping identify not only just the sites, geographically across the United States, but the certain patients or their caregivers or whatnot, with the speed that they're able to go in and look for those patients and help us recruit for that trial has been really valuable. And I don't think we could have done that without that long-term standing relationship with Christy's group. And I would just say another thing. I think more and more we're seeing the need for companies to incorporate patients' input into these clinical trial designs. We know the FDA is having patient-centric focused meetings to get more input and voice and share a voice from the patient. What are they going through? What is their quality of life? How do we design a trial with taking into consideration all of their needs? And so I think we're going to see more and more and more of that over the next years and decades to come. So it's really important that we partner with the advocacy groups and keep that long-term relationship going, to be able to get to the patients, find out if they're interested in participating in these trials, helping with identifying who could be a candidate for the trial and who may not be a good candidate for the trial. And if you're going at that alone and you don't have a good advocacy partner, it can be tough. It can be a long road. It can take a lot longer to get your trial enrolled, and ultimately to hopefully get some good results that can benefit the patient. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. All really good points. And I think, with COVID and the pandemic and that placing a barrier on the ability to go to sites, we saw that drive a big increase in the application of digital technology to clinical trials, in many indications. And obviously that was critical here in being able to connect with those patients. And I think in terms of maintaining that relationship and being patient-centric, being able to support the patients within their home, like this was a condition where they would be administering those eye drops on a day-to-day basis, every day and themselves. So being able to conduct the observations through the video monitoring module in the platform helped make sure that, the patients could do this repeatedly in that same setting when they needed to, with the advantage of having those videos available for regulators to review to confirm that, the ophthalmologist perception of the bottle being usable, the patient's report of the bottle being usable, all kind of lined up and there was strong agreement. And so I think in addition to this growing adoption of the patient's perspective as being critical in all phases, careful thought into where we apply digital, how we do collaborate with sites and the expertise and support that they bring to a study, I think is going to be increasingly something that we'll see evolve. So Jenny, that brings me to a question for you. Based on your experience working with a variety of sponsors and advocacy groups and kind of the various practices within Alira, what in your view is kind of the most important takeaway that the audience could have to keep in mind when striving to do a better job partnering with patients?
Well, of course, I can't limit it to just one.
That's fair. We have some time, so give us your best lessons.
I know. I wish I could trim it down to just one, but that's impossible. So I guess first and foremost is never underestimate the importance of an advocacy partner. Just for a number of reasons. To start in rare, a lot of times you get the dual benefit of they are, influencers and have this reach into a patient population, but then they often also have the lived experience themselves or of a family member that they're caring for. So, you want to, when you're planning a patient-centric trial or any phase of product life cycle, I think it's important to get both a patient advocacy viewpoint and a lived experience viewpoint. And when you get into larger patient populations where advocacy organizations may have, many full-time employees, many of them might not have the lived experience of that disease, which is fine. They're still doing great work. But when you're working in a rare disease, especially, you get the benefit of usually, more often than not, those advocacy organizations will give you both the lived experience perspective, and they'll give you that kind of influencer perspective of knowing the population and having reach at a larger level. So, especially in rare, it's huge because you kind of get a twofer in terms of the insights that you can get. They are another important thing is to remember that a lot of times they're volunteers, again, especially in rare, where they may not have any full-time employees at the organization. It's really important to keep in mind, as I kind of alluded to earlier, to be super grateful for what they're providing and also be flexible for what their kind of ability is to contribute and their timeline or schedule. So, I always think about whether you're working with patients themselves or, caregivers to patients, it's important to keep in mind that a lot of times things might pop up in their schedule related to, health and health issues that may necessitate a change in the timeline or, when you might have scheduled to meet. And so it's important to keep that in mind and just remember that this partnership is worth it, and maybe changing your timeline a bit is going to be worth it in the long run. I remember Christy also said that just having an NDA in place with an advocacy organization can be a huge win, as a very easy thing to do, so that you can talk to the advocacy organization more early when things aren't maybe not allowed or ready yet to be publicized to the general population. At least you can have those conversations with board members or employees and start to get their insights earlier on, but also just kind of get them prepared for what's coming. If you can start to talk to an advocacy organization when you're designing the protocol for a trial, then they have kind of a heads up that that's coming, and they can start to plan for that, and maybe, what their plans are going to look like for the next year. Versus if you only, kind of reach out to them when the trial is live on clinicaltrials.gov and you're enrolling all of a sudden, then, it gives them less of a heads up, less time to plan. And as Christy mentioned earlier, leaves them feeling less of like an active participant. Like you really kind of want their input, and like they really are an important stakeholder in the process. So yeah, that's my top ones. I couldn't limit to just one, but
Yes.
I limited to the top highlights.
Nice. Fair enough. Well, thank you so much. I think this is probably a good juncture for us to pause and just see if there are any questions that have come in from the audience. And this is a reminder that if you do have a question and you haven't already put it in the chat box there, please go ahead and do so. Yeah, but Jean, I think you were monitoring that for us. If you give us an update.
Yeah, so we do have one here, and it's how do you handle cases where the business goals and patient centricity goals seem to conflict?
Thanks. That's a very good question. Eileen, did you maybe want to tackle that one from the sponsor's perspective first?
I'll try. Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, we didn't have like that big conflicts, right? Did we, Christy, in this particular trial? So, I mean, I guess again, that speaks to the strength of our relationship. But I think that, that we would have to have some really good dialogue and meeting and discussion about what are the barriers. And that would, involve many stakeholders and shareholders, whether it be with the advocacy and an internal and the clinical operations team and so on and so forth, and our CRO as well. I think you'd have to start by identifying, what are the barriers? What are the challenges that we have to tackle? In our case, things went pretty smoothly. So we're fortunate that we didn't have tons of those. Not to toot our horn like too much, but we're very fortunate. But that's because we had this long-standing relationship. But I think in those cases, or one-off situations, you've got to identify what those barriers are and start tackling those early in the process. Head on. And again, the NDA and that, I agree, has to be in place, and you have to have that dialogue going. So I don't know, that's what I have in my answer, but if anyone else has another thought, but yeah.
I mean, I think, and I apologize, I lost my connection for a minute, but I'm back.
Yes, thanks for coming.
Sure. I think transparency is really, the most important thing here. And I think, there are going to be times that, our perspective as an advocacy group in our community, what we want, and, what's the most important for a sponsor are not aligned. We hope that most of the time they are, but, there's certainly cases where they're not. And I think having a relationship in place, that we're highlighting today allows you to have those sort of tough conversations in a transparent way. When we can, walk through with the sponsor, why they're making a choice that maybe, we think, isn't the best for the community. And to be clear again, as Eileen stated, that wasn't the case for this case study, but there's certainly examples of that, that I can think of in the cystinosis community. So.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think it's certainly, I think, Eileen, the fact that it was like, oh, this isn't something we've encountered often really speaks to how patient-centric your organization is. And I think that kind of philosophical mindset of being patient-centric will inform whether this is something that is, a big issue or not. And, there are certain conditions where, especially when you start to think about, market access and what payers are going to think and the regulatory piece, that there may be much more kind of clinical focused goals that the patients may not connect to as deeply. Right. And that's where, in addition to that early involvement that you mentioned, I think thinking about the entire product lifecycle can be so important, because ultimately, if the patients have an unmet need or a concern that is not being appropriately addressed, if not necessarily in that specific study, but more broadly as it relates to that treatment, that it eventually will impact the business goals in some way. So it's important to, I think, thoughtfully think through how it can be addressed, if not as an endpoint per se. That's still very important feedback to recognize that there is potentially that clash, and, you know, Christy, to your point, have those transparent, tough conversations.
Yeah, and I think having a partner, you know, with advocacy leaders, you know, who can help the community understand some of these, you know, differences, and you know what's good for one and not the other, are complicated and difficult to understand for those who, you know, aren't well acquainted with, you know, pharmaceutical development and, you know, what's involved. And I think we as advocacy leaders can help our community, you know, understand and work through those, and see ways that, you know, we can still advocate for what's best for our community, you know, still working with our partners to come to a best, you know, outcome.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you mentioned the endpoints. I mean, there's going to be trials in the future, or maybe going on now in these spaces where the patient does not agree. You know, we want, this is our endpoint, or the FDA wants this as an endpoint, and the patients are like, no, this is all wrong. So yeah, exactly. Gotta hit that. Understand.
And Jenny,
great riff with the patients, or you know, we hear the patients. So loud and clear.
Yeah, I was going to echo what you said, Renee, where, you know, Leadiant, you guys have the benefit of having that as a part of your company culture, which is, you know, the value of that can't be overstated. Luckily, you know, we at Alira Health also have that as such an intrinsic part of our company culture, so much so that we, you know, kind of provide strategy consulting to other sponsors for how to make that a part of their culture. You know, what I see is, you know, when I saw this question, I was kind of like, I feel like they do not conflict nearly as much as you might think. I think that a lot of times people that have more of a business and commercial mindset, if you really dig down into the why they have the position that they have, you know, pro or against a certain standpoint, you'll realize that it's really actually very aligned with a patient-centric strategy. They might just not have as much of that experience in more of a patient-centric, you know, kind of company culture, or you know, kind of experience doing real patient engagement or doing patient-informed trials. So, you know, when you kind of expose them to some case studies, you know, hopefully webinars like this help expose more sponsors out there to the value of this type of work. And so, you know, hopefully, you know, this is one way that we can help some of those adversarial groups kind of align that this is in the best interest.
Definitely. I think we're also seeing that especially in the real world evidence space, when we think about what methodologies or data points we can use to address those questions. It's also changing that perception and landscape, because often what matters to patients can be, you know, quote unquote, messier or more challenging to measure and to incorporate in analysis deliberately. And so now with things like digital tools, the ability to capture patients, you know, thoughts in free text or through a wearable, you can start to measure certain endpoints that previously we might have recognized were important to the patient, but not known how to kind of really dig into them methodologically. So that's another, I think, exciting avenue where we can collectively work as an industry to continue to center the patient's view and make sure that their experience is prioritized and appropriately measured. Yeah, so thank you so much for that question.
Yeah, we have another one here if you want to keep going with questions.
Yeah, perfect.
Great. So especially with smaller populations, how concerned are you with seeking more diversity in studies or registries?
That's a good question. Christy, as a representative of a very small, rare patient population, did you want to take that one first?
Sure. And I think, you know, we think about this, and I think diversity can mean a lot of things, you know, diverse in, you know, making sure that, you know, in terms of gender and race and, you know, geographic location, you know, for genetic disorders, you know, sometimes, you know, that sort of, those kinds of diversities, you know, aren't represented within the disease state, but, you know, within cystinosis, they are to a certain extent. And one thing that we think about in particular in our US population is really reaching out to folks who maybe don't, you know, people are sometimes surprised when, you know, we say, well, we still print newsletters. Why do you do that? Well, a lot of our folks don't really have reliable internet. In fact, I didn't today, but,
Yeah.
or access at all, right? So just different ways that we can reach out to people who maybe aren't seeing the information that we're putting out, whether it's for, clinical trial recruitment or, registry or whatever it is that we're talking about, through non-traditional channels. You think you go out through social media and you have a website and newsletters, but there are people who feel disconnected from communities for whatever reason. And sometimes you have to be more creative in how you reach those folks. And we actually have a campaign currently where we're trying to reach every single person, with cystinosis that we in the US, and then, hopefully eventually globally in some way, and support them. And so, those kinds of efforts within rare disease, in particular, small rare diseases like cystinosis, can be really difficult. And so I think for us, that's the way that, diversity efforts are looking.
No, it's very relevant to consider, the geographic, like rural versus urban, access to technology, digital literacy, all of those kind of features of a person's aptitude or environment or preference is important to consider. So even, as we talk about digital creating opportunities for more patients to participate if they don't live close to a site, digital could also potentially exclude other participants. So being able to offer opportunities for them to engage either by provisioning devices or making like satellite internet available, sending a nurse to the home, really thinking outside the box to be able to include those patients where it's not quite as straightforward. And that's where I think sponsors also have to open their mind to investing in those opportunities and things like that. And so certainly even just in making this study all digital, if we go back to the case study that we talked about today, Leadiant was very open to a variety of solutions that we brought to the table to make it possible to pull this off.
From a patient perspective, an all digital trial, when that makes sense, is ideal. It's less intrusive, and just works so well. There's obviously most instances where this isn't really a possibility, but in this case, it just worked so well.
Definitely.
I'll hop in with another point if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I think, on that topic of diversity, obviously, I think there's two pieces to that of why it's important. One is obviously we want trials to be more representative of the populations that they're serving. And so we don't want a drug or a device or a diagnostic to come to market that hasn't even tested part of the patients that they're trying to reach. That doesn't feel inclusive, and that doesn't feel like, if you were in that population that wasn't represented in the trial, then you may have doubts about whether or not it's going to work for you or be safe for you. So there's that as kind of a base case. But I think another piece that, even if we take that kind of like health equity lens off, we also, you went over it earlier in the presentation, where the majority of our trials are failing to meet their timelines. And, we're having an issue recruiting for trials, period. And so I think it's even just for the improving the timeline of a trial, reducing the cost of a trial, it's necessary to include more diverse participants just to ensure more successful trials. And so I think there's a dual benefit to including more diverse participants. And, we talked about many of the ways that we can make trials, both, interventional studies, but also observational studies, more, kind of attractive to more diverse participants. But to me, the most basic way is just to involve diverse participants when you're planning the study. So when you're designing the protocol and designing, how many site visits are patients going to have to do, what the timing availability, a lot of patients have to take off work and they might have multiple jobs, and the time that they can take off might be very limited. So if you only offer them weekdays from 9 to 5, that's going to exclude a large portion of the population. So all of those sorts of things, it's important to involve these underrepresented groups when you're planning what the study is going to look like and, doing the protocol design, so that from the outset, we can make sure it's as inclusive as possible.
For sure. Really good points, Jenny. Well, we're getting close to time. I think we probably have an opportunity to take one more question.
Yeah, absolutely. And Everybody, if you have more questions, put them in the chat and we'll try to get our team here to address them to you via email if you'd like. But in the meantime, while you have a few minutes to still get them in, here's another question for everybody to discuss is, how have you addressed the issue of misalignment between regulatory and patient preferences for relevant endpoints?
Good one. So I think that's somewhat similar to kind of what we discussed earlier in terms of, that importance of early engagement, of being able to connect, the patient centricity and business goals. And I think when it specifically comes to the stage of clinical trial and where there's more of a focus on kind of the results of analysis and, sensitivity of statistical methods and how we're really going to demonstrate safety and efficacy and how we want to measure that. I think that's where all these kind of things that we've discussed this morning kind of come into play from my view, at least in real world evidence, where we're often trying to determine, how can we try and connect the diversity of the patient population to the variables that we want to make sure that we're controlling for when we're looking at something that's interventional. And I think in something like an observational study or a later phase trial, it's easier to make that case from a methods perspective, and in being more diverse, in being very patient centric and including endpoints that are fuzzier to measure. And I think that's kind of the tension that we're seeing as an industry in trying to balance that risk to a regulatory decision by including the many variables to wanting to know earlier on how those variables kind of come into play in terms of safety and efficacy as well. So we see that across a variety of indications and different patient populations. But I, open it up to Eileen and Christy as well to comment from their view on how those kinds of issues.
I have this is usually, within the rare disease world, this is the most glaring, disconnect that I see between regulatory requirements and sponsors and patient communities. And that's the inclusion of placebo arms in trials. And so that's something that comes up all the time within a lot of communities, in particular, devastating, really, fast progressing disorders. We hear, people in the ALS community talk a lot about this, others, and that kind of you can talk about, utilizing, registry data, real world evidence, a natural history study to take the place of a placebo arm. So, but I think those conversations, I would categorize that in the same area when we talk about, having that relationship in place with leaders who can, that stuff is difficult to try to explain to your community that the FDA wants this, the sponsor has to do it for us to go through this study. This is required. This is, for, several different reasons, statistical, and others, proving efficacy that this is something that's been required. So that's the most common and the most glaring disconnect that I usually see, between regulatory requirements and what a patient community wants.
Right.
I would just say it's really important for the sponsor to have these discussions with the regulators upfront and early in the process, and not, wait down the line. Like, be transparent. We talk about transparency and having this ongoing dialogue to the extent you can, way up front and early on.
Yeah, early and often to discuss.
And often.
Go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead, Jenny.
I was just going to echo Christy's comment, and as we also, through Health Storylines, besides just, clinical trials, we also run patient registries for advocacy organizations. And so having those conversations with advocacy organizations about how to message the registry to their participants, to really activate them to participate, and not just once, but continue to log in and, donate their data to the registry, is something that we're super actively interested in and invested in as well.
Yeah. Definitely being able to make sure that there are those opportunities for synthetic control arms, or making it easier for sponsors to not necessarily have to take that approach. Amazing. Well, thank you all so much for your contributions to a very thoughtful discussion. As Jean mentioned, if you do have other questions, feel free to submit them and we can try and get back to folks by email with answers to the group. But thank you so much for your attention today, and we look forward to the holiday period and everyone having a chance to spend time with their families, and we appreciate you taking the time to be with us today.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And as a reminder, this was recorded and will be available to anybody who would like to view it, colleagues, anybody who you think would benefit from it. So that will be up within the next 48 hours. And thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to Alira for sponsoring this.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.